fairly informally today. That's quite nice. Fantastic. Apologies, I've got one from Dr. Wayne Beelby. Can I have a mover for that apology? Moved by Councillor Hollis, seconded by Councillor Salisbury. I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, and carries. Now, I can see His Worship the Mayor of the Western Bay back there, Mayor Gary Weber. For our public forum today, Mayor Gary has requested to speak. Mayor Gary, you have 10 minutes, although, you know, the Chair might give a bit more if you need it. Thank you for coming in and speaking to us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mayor Tenby, councillors, staff, members of the public. I'm here today wearing two hats. Firstly, as the Deputy Chair of Smart Growth, but equally as the Mayor of one of your UFTI partners. Please rest assured I'm comfortable wearing both hats simultaneously, as the message I wish to give is consistent for both. Firstly, Mayor Tenby and the new council, I think it's great that you have taken an unvarnished look at your finances and are prepared to, if I read the paper correctly, and I'm sure I have, that you are grappling with what you have inherited from past councils. I accept the situation that you find yourselves in is not of your making. My own view that it has been a work in progress for your predecessors for about 10 to 12 years. But having said that, the solution for getting Tauranga back on track again falls squarely on the shoulders of the governance people around the table today. As you work your way forward to find the solution, I need to bring to your attention the agreement that the UFTI partners made as the basis for us agreeing to fund the UFTI project, and it reads as follows. The partners endorse that the analysis and agreed recommendations contained in the UFTI final report, once confirmed by the partners, be provided to the relevant partner committees and governance bodies as a key input into relevant planning and financial planning processes. In 2004 and 2009, similar agreements were reached, but for a myriad of reasons, some organisations did not take the capital component and the operating component of those agreements through to the long-term plans and 30-year asset management plans. They therefore did not go through to the regional land transport plans, and therefore they did not go through the National Land Transport Plan, which meant they did not happen as per the narrative. I want to buy a Rolls Royce, but I don't want to pay for it. You'll never get the Rolls Royce. We have come a long way since the current government came to power in 2017, and it's imperative that we include our best guess estimates of the capital and operating spend we, the UFTI partners, see that collectively we need to invest to bring our own transport system up to at least 2020. The Minister, when he spoke to us just after the election, he made it very clear, I don't want to worry about how we eat the elephant, we just need to work out how big the elephant is. Once we identify that, that's the critical thing, and he is expecting us to have that information to him very soon, before the end of this financial year. The funding we have to then collectively work out. That is the expectation of your partners in UFTI and central government, that Tauranga City will look at the capital issues you've got in front of you and take them through to your annual plans and your long-term plans. When Minister Twyford phoned me recently to tell me about the 900 million for the road between Cameron Road and Amokarawa, he urged me to let Mayor Tenby know that when we have completed the UFTI story, there will be more investment to come for this area. Your UFTI partners have every expectation you will rise to the occasion and take those best guess estimates through to your annual plans, long-term plans, and 30-year asset management plans. We are confident that as the new team, you will apply your combined skills and leadership to find the most appropriate way forward. But it's been made very clear to us by the Minister, that's the Minister of Transport and Grant Robertson, we have one opportunity to get more significant transport investment from central government. One more opportunity for them to assist us to make our sub-region one of the most livable in the world, and now is not the time for central government and the NZTA board to think we, the implementers, are shirking our responsibilities as we did in 2004 and 2009. Wouldn't it be great for each and every one of you new councillors around the table today to be able to say in time, I was part of the team that got Tauranga back on track to be the best little city in the world. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mayor Gary. Are you happy to take questions from my colleagues?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Councillor Robson, then Councillor Abri.
Yeah, look, Gary, I think the points you make are very, very apposite for the place we find ourselves in Tauranga. I think your observations about 2004 and 2009 are absolutely correct. The challenge we as a council face, of course, is that conversation with the Minister, which said, work out how big the elephant is, and we'll work out the funding later, right, doesn't work for the Audit Office. When we put our long-term plan together, and that needs to be signed off in some 15 months or so, we have to have the funding in there. We can't put to be confirmed or subject to discussion with central government. So how do we get round that problem where central government are making promises and frankly they're not good at keeping promises? How do we get round the problem of when we put our long-term plan together of avoiding having to be confirmed on the funding side? I think everyone knows the size of the problem. Getting the size of the problem right is not the issue. The issue in 2004, the issue in 2009 is funding. We can't put TBC in, it won't be accepted by Audit New Zealand. How do we get around that problem?
Relatively easily. I think if you read the report you have in front of you, you're talking about a rate increase from 1st of July this year, which has got a number of 17.6 in it. That's where you have to start. You know, some of us, I'm responding to the question, I try to be diplomatic, but some of us have been saying that to Tauranga City now for nearly 9 years.
Supplementary, Councillor Robson.
I don't know whether you're aware, Mayor Webber, of some analysis and data recently supplied by staff. I've had it confirmed by our effectively Chief Financial Officer that Tauranga City, if you divide the total residential rate by the number of residential rating units, Tauranga City has a higher mean rate than Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington, Christchurch, or Dunedin. We already have the highest mean residential rates of any of the major metros. The analysis also shows, of course, that there is effectively, if you benchmark us against similar sized cities of those metros, a $49 million shortfall in our commercial rate. Are you suggesting we should increase our commercial rate by some 140% to close that gap?
No, I'm not. I'm suggesting you read your papers and use the 17.6. I also would suggest, and I've read the table in your report, it's an interesting calculation. Most other councils do not use what they would take. What I would suggest is you as councillors look at what is the median, and the median house price in here in Tauranga is $660,000. What is that rateable value property paying in rates? And compare that to the others, because some of us have actually done that, and you'll see that in Western Bay, for instance, somebody in Te Puke or Katikati or Makaroa pays significantly more than the same value property in Tauranga. And if you go to Pororua, which is even more deprived, they pay significantly more again. So, you know, I suppose it's which way you cut the cake and whether you really want to look at a number that you like or look at a number you don't like. I prefer to look at the hard number and take the hard decisions. That's why Western Bay is quoted as the highest rated district in New Zealand for residential rates. It's not a place we're proud to have, but we're proud of our assets and we're proud of our district.
Councillor Abri.
I'm just wondering if we have anything in writing from central government in terms of maybe an MOU to help inform the decision making, because it feels a bit to me like we're getting it second hand from yourself and Mayor Tenby, but we haven't had the discussion directly with the ministers.
with all due respect, I suggest you read, I think it's section 103 of the Local Government Act, where it refers to funding and finance, where you have to put a prudent, balanced budget together, and your 30-year asset management plan. If you have narrative that you're going to do stuff, you need to have the financials in your accounts. There has been a disparate group or a disparate gap between the narrative and the funding, from my observation, for at least 7 years. And I think you might find the Office of the Auditor General has a similar opinion. But that's the law. You don't need anything from the Minister. You just need to read the Act, which you all and all of us swore allegiance to uphold.
Mayor Tenby.
Thank you, Chair, and Mayor Webber, thank you very much for coming in. I think it's time to stop the rhetoric, which is tedious, the planning, which is tedious, and we know the problem. I can tell, and I have told all the councillors, that when I got involved in this, and I was briefed by Mayor Webber around the history of what the Minister said before the local body elections. As you know, I've met Twyford on a number of occasions, and I won't necessarily repeat what's been said, but yesterday, or was it the day before, Gary, we had lunch with Sir Brian Roach and what is effectively the gentleman who's the head of infrastructure for NZTA. They reiterated the same thing. They said, if you guys cannot make a decision at TCC, if you cannot continue to work collectively as a team for the Western Regional Bay Planning, which is with Western Bay, and there is a question coming here, Chair, Bay Planning Regional Council, you will not get that money. That money, $850,000 or 900, whatever, however you want to cut it, is at risk. It's at risk if we don't plan, if we don't produce a conjoint plan that sees the sub-region out to a number of years, with TCC taking a major lead as the epicentre of that region, it is at risk. So we can have all the rhetoric, we can give all the statistics, we can create all the problems with what we should or shouldn't be doing. The reality is this, that if we don't move the city forward, we will not be a part of sub-regional funding in the future, period. That is it. Gary, my question is this, did you have a good weekend?
Not too bad. I was preparing for this meeting.
Right.
And you know, I make the point, because I moved that resolution and Doug Leader seconded it, about we're in AFTI together. If one of the partners is not prepared to take these numbers through to their annual plan, long-term plan, and 30-year asset management plan, we have to ask the question at Western Bay, why should we invest another $750,000 into AFTI if one of the partners is not prepared to uphold their part of the bargain? We have to ask that question. So is smart growth, should we be funding it if one of the partners is going to go and do its own thing and leave the rest of us out to dry? Thank you.
Any further questions? Mayor Tenby, you did ask two questions. One was, which day did we have lunch? Which was the first question. Well done. Councillor Clout.
Thank you very much, Mayor Webber, for coming in. When we're trying to close this gap, because clearly there's a significant gap, we've got a number of levers we can pull. We've sort of focused a lot on rates, the rates lever, but we also have the amount of debt we can pull on board. We've also got the commercial differential, which I think is an important lever. We also have, of course, cutting down capital expenditure and then looking at our staff and operations. So what other of those levers do you consider that we should be looking at and to bridge this gap?
To sum up some diplomacy, like all organisations, you have to look at the whole lot. But the one you have to face, and I suggest you ask your staff to put a table together of a $660,000 rateable property value. What is the rates paid across New Zealand, and compare it? Because the Taxpayers Union, local government, put out this table every year. And it's very rare that I've seen in the last 10 years for Tauranga City to be at the top. So, you know, you've got to show to the people that, and this is central government, if you want money from them, you need to show that you're prepared to do your bit. Western Bay has spent over $600 million on roading over the last 10 to 15 years. we had to do it. And if you look at our rate increases going back to about 2004, 8s and 9s for 5 and 6 years in a row have been okay. And there has never been a mayor tipped out at an election. They have all retired, or unfortunately one of them passed away. So we haven't had, this can't put the rates up, we won't get re-elected. That doesn't wash in our part of the world. Sorry, I was trying to be diplomatic.
Final question from Councillor Kelley. Oh, and Councillor Hughes as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do we also have to listen to our community as well? So I understand what you're saying, but is it also appropriate that we listen to our entire Tauranga community as well?
Well, I'd suggest you've got a population of about 140,000. It's whether you listen to the squeaky 2,000 or the silent majority. And I, with Councillor Robson and Councillor Baldock, we went around a significant public consultation over the future development strategy about 18 months ago. The clear message everywhere was grow some balls and get on with it. And that was from an 82-year-old lady who lives out in Greerton. They don't want the congestion. They just want us to fix it. So you've got to be careful who you listen to.
As a lady, I'm probably not going to do that last comment that you just said, but thank you.
Councillor Hughes.
Hi, Gary. Just going back to the last, John's comments about the ratio between our commercial rates and our residential rates. We do have the lowest commercial rates differential in the 5 major cities. So I'm just wondering, what is your thoughts around doing, when we do a rates increase? Obviously, a lot of these commercial activities are due to the port being here. We've got some major industry. We've got more major industry coming on board, and we've got the port itself, which creates a lot of the problems with congestion and with the growth issues that we're having to deal with. What's your thoughts around what we should do with those ratios in this annual plan?
Well, unfortunately, under the local government, if you're making a change like that, you have to consult. And I don't think Tauranga City is a lot different from Western Bay. You look at our average rateable residential property is worth, just close to $600,000. But we have forests which are worth millions. We've got 60-hectare kiwi fruit orchards which are worth $700 or $800 million. Sorry, not quite right, 70 or 80 million. So you've got to work out your rating base, and that's for councillors to decide. It's in your hands.
I'm just wondering, do you know the rates differential then for Western Bay as in comparison to Tauranga City in terms of commercial versus residential?
Yes, we do, because every year, if you look at our annual report that goes out, we break our rates across the district into residential, commercial, industrial, horticultural, and so we know the differences. And in terms of Tauranga City, Councillor Robson, has been telling me for quite some time about the differential issue. But as I said, Western Bay can't resolve that for you. It's people sitting around this table have to resolve that.
Thank you, Mayor Webber. Thank you for coming and presenting to us. The witness is excused. Thank you. Folks, we'll move into our agenda now. Just by way of some guidance for how things are going to run today, this morning is largely, in fact exclusively, going to be questions. If we can leave our political statements, or any statements, in fact, till the afternoon session. Once we've heard all of the information, we'll be in a good place to make some decisions. So the Chair will progressively get stricter on that particular point until the morning has concluded. So we'll have questions, we'll have staff presentations, and then we'll be into decision making in the afternoon. Councillor Robson, you have a question of the chair.
Yes, just for guidance, does everyone get one tenby per meeting,
I don't-
i.e. the ability to make a statement?
No. See how I turned your... Can you see how I turned your microphone off then? So that was a very... Thank you for providing the example. No, we're not going to have a back and forth yet. We're going to get on with business. So acceptance of late items. Are there any late items? Councillor Baldock.
This isn't a late item, but just a query. If by some, some people believe in miracles around the table. Well, pleased to hear that. If we do conclude questions earlier, I assume we are not going to break and wait till after lunch. We will carry on with the program. There's 2 other items on the agenda that we will deal with. Is that correct? Thank you.
Okay, confidential business to be transferred into the open. There is no confidential business. Change to the order of business. I have to ask if there's a change to the order of business, but there isn't. Declarations of conflict of interest. Colleagues, are there any declarations in that regard? We all pay rates. Moving on to the business. So the first order of business is we're going to hear from our Chief Executive, Marty Grenfell, who's going to set the scene for the staff presentations this morning. Then we'll hear from Paul Davidson, and we have an NZIER presentation, Infrastructure New Zealand presentation. So we've got a reasonably full morning. A reminder, let's keep it to questions, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You did steal a wee bit of my thunder. Yes, but that's fine. So it might be helpful for everyone present here today just to understand how the day will unfold. So this morning we will hear from Christine Jones, who will provide some background into vital signs. So as we consider this year's annual plan, which is effectively the last working year of the long-term plan before we revisit it, we find ourselves in a financial situation that requires us to make some steps through this annual plan to ensure that we maintain our debt to revenue ratio below 250%. That will also have a flow-on impact through our capital and operational budgets for the remaining years of the long-term plan, which fortunately we'll have an opportunity to reset next financial year. So following Christine's update on the Vital Signs project, which was a survey of over 5,000 residents, essentially that information will help set the scene and provide a bit of guidance and direction on what our community are telling us as we make these annual plan decisions and consider the long-term plan ramifications. Paul will provide a comprehensive presentation on our current financial position, so that will help inform both this year's and future years' decision making. We'll hear from the New Zealand Institute for Economic Research, who have completed an economic impact assessment based on the back of the Veros report, which describes our current, immediate and future land and housing issues. And then that'll be followed by a presentation by Paul Blair, who's the Chief Executive of New Zealand Infrastructure, or Infrastructure New Zealand, who will, I think, provide a wider context about the issues that New Zealand is facing, particularly in the high growth areas, and essentially the ability and funding and financing mechanisms that are posing a problem or a challenge for certainly the high growth areas. And so following that, we'll move into the full report that considers this annual plan, and we'll work through that and under the guidance of the chair. So perhaps back to you, but Christine's next in the pecking order.
Thank you, and there's plenty of thunder and lightning in that, so nothing stolen. Christine Jones. While we get the presentation up, I realise that some colleagues may need to preface their questions just so that it's understandable, and as one who struggles to get to the point sometimes, I would be rather unkind not to afford that opportunity to my colleagues. However, just for this meeting, see this piece of paper here. If people are not asking questions, then this will be displayed, and I'll be keeping a record for our own private consumption later as to who has been shown the yellow card more than others. Christine Jones.
So this first slide, morning, just deals with the matters that the Chief Executive's covered on how we're going to work through the day. We are going to run the whiteboard process, so we'll answer whatever questions that we can, but particularly in the afternoon, it's possible that you might ask some quite specific questions that we don't have at our fingertips. They will be parked on the whiteboard, and then we'll come back at intervals, at breaks, and pick up any matters that are sitting on the whiteboard outstanding. So just in terms of the vital signs, so last year we brought to the Council the concept of working with partners being Acorn, TECT and Bay Trust to get a better understanding about what our community thinks of their city and what they want their city to be. And the idea about this was some quite broad questions that would provide some context and assist the council as it starts to develop its LTP, and then some more quite very specific questions that would assist our community development team and the council as it works with particular parts of our community. That work is still not complete yet. Our partners have agreed to us providing this information to you, given the issues and challenges that you're facing, and the more information you have about what the community is looking for, the better informed you are to make the choices through the annual plan. It was a very comprehensive survey, and we've spent quite a lot of effort trying to reach those hard to reach, or perhaps those people who don't engage, so elderly, disability, ethnic communities, etc. So quite a broad representation. The survey ran from mid-November through to mid-February and had over 5,000 responses. The data that I'm going to share with you is only from the first 3,800 because not all of it has been fully input, but it'll give you a bit of a feel. Once all of the results are in and the quality assurance processes, you'll get the complete information reported to you in April. So we asked in the survey, just all these were open-ended questions, so they weren't tick box, it was open-ended, and people put what they felt down. So what was the main reason why people love living in Tauranga? Really high. It's really about the environment that we live in, the place that is Tauranga, the landscape, the beach, the nature, the outdoors, the climate, etc. Again, another open-ended question about if there's one thing that you could change, what would that be? And very much this is matters that are within the ambit of council to address in partnership with other partners like NZTA, Western Bay, the Regional Council. So the issue around roading and transportation, roading infrastructure, public transport, and then also interestingly the role of the CPD in the city and the importance of the CPD came out as a strong factor that the community were raising. On the question of what needs to be preserved, what needs to be protected, what do people want to look after in their community, a really strong emphasis around the green space, our environment, our reserves, looking after that and retaining it, and also our waterways, our beaches, our harbour. And then quite strongly sitting around that 18% is culture, place, Māori history and heritage was something that came out quite strongly. And then you see at 11% transport again coming through, and again the issue of the CBD. So some common themes coming through each of these questions. And then on the question about do you have any comments about the future of Tauranga, so again open-ended question, the issue of transport featuring very highly again in this, around need for better roading, looking to have it easier to move around the city. Interesting, seeking leadership, so representation, decision making, which very much is your ambit. So looking for leaders in our community to make changes and take the community forward. And then coming again at third is, and fourth, same thing around the transport and the CPD.
Thanks, Christine. So just purpose of just that first section was really just as we work through the day that a lot of the investment that you see coming through the annual plan and then moving into the long-term plan is actually very aligned to effectively those key elements, particularly you see around transportation and some of the solutions that we're suggesting around that. So before I just get into the rest of the presentation, it is quite a lot to go through, so suggestion with the indulgence of the Chair is that we work through a section and take questions on that particular section. It is very aligned to the report, so there's a section on history, there's a section on what's changed since December, and then we move into some of the options going forward. So rather than going through the entire presentation, that we actually pause at those points to see if there are any particular questions. So first section, just talking about history of investment and funding. And
Sorry, apologies, Paul, midstream. I was just wondering if there were any questions of the vital signs presentation. Obviously, Christine didn't conduct a survey herself in her spare time, but I'm just wondering if there are any questions from my colleagues on that. No, fantastic. Please continue.
Thank you. So just to start off on the history of investment and funding, and I think the first important point is that the situation that we're looking at the moment is not a new one for Tauranga. It's been in place for quite some time. In 2009, we went to the community with a conversation about some of our financial sustainability issues, and that resulted in, at that point, the introduction of some debt management provisioning to actually manage that debt going forward. Subsequent to that, we sold Route K, which did actually obviously have a fairly significant favourable debt impact. However, what we're continuing to see is the investment demands for a growing city outstripping our ability to actually fund and finance that. So in terms of, I've noted 4 points up there in terms of some of the key things that are impacting on that investment now. First one is just the amount of serviceable land that we need to deliver to the city, and the cost of actually delivering that continues to grow. We'll come back to that later in the presentation, but it's one of the key cost drivers. Sustainability of the transport network. So looking back to the vital signs, it was very clear it was, if not the top, but one of the top elements on every one of those slides. That continues to need significant investment to actually deal with that. Ongoing growth pressures, I'll come back to that in a moment, and also with regard to infrastructure resilience and climate change impacts, we have allowed and continue to allow for more investment within the long-term plan to actually deal with these significant issues, which in short, the bulk of them are driving costs north fairly significantly. Have you got the first point, and just the current funding and financing model is inadequate. So four key points on that. The alignment of growth funding and delivery, and that links to the next point in terms of growth does not pay for growth. So the biggest issue that we have around a lot of our growth funding is that we need to finance significant, large, chunky capital expenditure projects like Waiari, like Tamanga, like the Southern Pipeline, that have significant impact on our balance sheet but have long-term payback. So that stepped nature of that infrastructure means that we are often constantly challenged by the need to actually finance these projects with long payback periods, and that puts pressure on that key financial ratio, which I'll come to shortly. The fact that I think everyone in the room knows growth doesn't pay for growth. The current development contribution model pays for an element of growth, but not complete, and there's an operational cost flow on for that expenditure, which again, with that step nature, means that it doesn't align directly to your actual growth percentage. And the fact that it's a cost and not a value-based model. So our model is based on working out the costs that we have, dividing them by the rating population to set the rate. It's not a model that actually picks up on any value increment that occurs. Now, I know that there are some things in place that are looking at changing this, but at the moment, that's the model that we work on. So additional rating units do not lead to additional revenue, albeit they may spread the burden of rates over a higher population.
We have had revenue deficits, and I'll come to that slide in a moment, but over time, revenue has been set through a long-term plan. Not always, but sometimes we actually bring that number down through annual plan years, which has meant that our revenue is actually lower than was set on a long-term basis. And the higher debt pressures are coming in from a number of different angles. Price is going up. We're seeing economic conditions mean that price is continually challenged. We're in a market that's quite competitive. All of the growth councils, or all of the councils effectively, are experiencing those costs increasing at a higher level than CPI. I mentioned before resilience and hazards, and that's driving costs both, not just in terms of new infrastructure, but renewing our existing infrastructure. So that's putting more and more pressure on that cost. And some of our contingencies, particularly in the area of leaky homes, are being realised at higher levels than we originally had forecast. Again, that is putting more and more pressure on that balance sheet. Graphically, what does it look like in terms of the long-term plan to the annual plan? So the top graph in this particular example shows the difference between the long-term plan and the annual plan based on option 1, which is in the current papers. That equates back to a mean 3.9% residential rate increase. So the rate increase through the 2019-20 year was some $4.5 million lower than the long-term plan. At that level, it's a further $17 million lower than the long-term plan. Within that, the waste collection service was budgeted for part of that year, and that's about $4.5 million of that, which flows into the following year now. In the second example, it shows exactly the same information except set at option 2, which is a 7.6% increase, and that is $13 million less than what sits in the long-term plan. So the important point with the lower the revenue effectively is meaning that our lower capacity to actually deliver on some of the infrastructure that we need, because it is having a significant impact on that revenue to debt ratio. On the other side of the equation, whilst the revenue is going south, the cost equation is going north. We haven't obviously redone the 2028 long-term plan. What we do know, though, is that at this point in time, there's around $338 million of increased costs coming into that long-term plan, and there are a number of significant projects that haven't been updated within that. So that's that cost pressure coming through, it's that resilience pressure coming through. As we get more refined in some of the design around some of those projects that were set in the long-term plan, they are putting pressure on some of that cost as well. So we're having a situation, like we probably should show it in red and not green, but where we've got our cost structure effectively increasing, whilst at the same time our revenue potentially going in the other direction. When we talk about a debt to revenue ratio, both the numerator and the denominator effectively moving in the opposite directions, creates almost the perfect storm. I might just pause there in terms of questions on that history bit, because now we'll just move into the section on how we've moved from December.
Okay, colleagues, questions on the history of investment and funding. Oh, look at that, there's a few hands. I'll start to my right, Councillor Baldock, and then I'll work my way to the left.
Paul, you've been sitting in that chair and giving this message for some time. How different is what you're saying? There was the question, Mr. Chairman. How? It's a question word. How different is the message you're giving us now than you gave 1 year ago? I've just pulled up the annual plan consultation document from a year ago. I hear you saying most of what is written there, that we were told a year ago that if we went for a low rate last year, we would be facing this. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, and going back, I guess, before that, is that the last long-term plan, we signalled that these issues were facing us in around about 2023. So the message is consistent in terms of that. What we're seeing, though, however, is that there has, and even from December, which I'll cover off a little bit more later, is that what we're seeing is costs basically increasing at a greater rate than what we actually anticipated, and some of those additional costs coming on stream earlier than what we had anticipated. So message is consistent, the timing is coming forward.
Yes, supplementary, Councillor Bourne.
And we went out to the community and asked them, we gave them options and asked them, can we have the summary of those responses? Because as I recall it, community was pretty balanced in saying we should be doing what we need to do. Is it easy to get that to us before today ends?
Yes, we'll park that on the whiteboard. I guess.
Checking, you were asking.
And-
We went out to the community with and what the responses were from the submissions.
Thank you. I think it was Councillor Arbery next.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. The paper has comment around an extra $500 million to $1 billion worth of expenditure that you expect to come online. I assume that wasn't shown on that graph, and I'm just wondering, at the moment the paper's recommending, well, it's saying over 3 years the rates would be, say, a 17% increase, 25% increase, totals 50% increase over 3 years. What would it look like if we included that extra $500 million to $1 billion worth of costs? What would the rates have to be to pay for all that infrastructure?
If I could just park that, because we'll come back to that in the further part of the presentation. If it's okay.
I think next was Councillor Robson.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. That was interesting. Can we just flick back the slides because it's easier to make reference? So the first slide where you talked about the history, I'm getting feedback from somewhere. The first slide talked about the history. You listed transport, provision of service, that there. Is it fair to say, I have some supplementary as well, Chair, that the first three are actually effectively all variations on growth, that we need to provide more serviceable land, that's because of growth pressure. The transport system has issues, that's because of growth pressure. And funnily enough, and it's almost a summary of the two above it, we've got greater investment required due to growth pressure. Is that a fair summary?
Through the chair, yes, that's fair. Some of the solutions have been expanded around in terms of that growth management as well. So we've, there is multimodal solutions within there. Coming back to the comment I made around resilience of networks, that's something that's factored in at a lot greater level effectively than what we had in the past as we get better information. So, but yes, the growing city is.
And of course, multimodal itself requires significant investment. Going on, you made the statement that everyone knows in a subsequent slide that growth doesn't pay for growth. How do you reconcile that with a narrative that was coming out of this council for years that growth pays for growth? How do we reconcile? I mean, I think it's difficult to reconcile it, but there was that narrative for a significant period of time, including some of the councillors sitting here now have had that narrative. You've been involved with council for some period of time. Has there been a change in narrative there? That's the question.
Can we just pause while we have a microphone change? Okay.
Yeah, that question, the narrative change.
I think what I would say is that there has been a lot. We started with a principle as growth pays for growth, and that was the principle at that time. And that was, the development contribution model, for example, has not been around forever. We've got a lot better in terms of actually the application of it, and I think what I would say is that we do actually maximise the use of that model as best we possibly can within the legislative boundaries that it operates within. However, as that model, as it's matured in terms of our understanding, it's been realised the fact that there are some areas where it is deficient in terms of allowing full cost recovery. So, yes, the narrative has changed over time.
Appreciate that. And that
One final question. Yep.
One more. But that honest narrative is really, really important for people to understand that, because I think we need that conversation with the city. One last question. You make reference to, and I frequently pick people up on this, and again a subsequent slide around finance and funding. Is it accurate to say that the government's lack of understanding of the local government funding model is so bad that they wind up giving us here in Tauranga the ability to access HIF funding, and our accessing of HIF funding, interest-free finance, right? Interest-free finance, i.e. a loan, actually had the perverse consequence of increasing the rating burden for Taronga's residential ratepayers. Is that correct?
In terms of, it is in the sense that the current HIF model potentially increases the rates. However, I think it's important to note that the HIF model was devised as an interest-free model prior to us seeing the level of low interest rates that we're seeing at this point in time. So the reason that the HIF model that results in that is that our ability to borrow has come down significantly to when that model was first envisaged. So there are a number of models that the government is working through to try and deal with, particularly the financing side of the equation. But it does need to be balanced with the funding conversation as well.
No, thank you for that.
Look, Councillor Clout, then Mayor Powell.
Thank you. Paul, the graph which shows the revenue shortfall. So obviously, a revenue shortfall is one thing, and I don't think we appreciate that, and we don't want that. But on the other side of the equation, if our expenditure has fallen to an equal degree, we're actually no worse off. So in those years, has our expenditure reduced roughly in line with that reduction in revenue?
Through the chair, some has, some hasn't. There has been some adjustments made to the way we fund things. For example, last annual plan, decisions were made in terms of some of the non-funding of depreciation, some of the introduction of rates into activities that have deficits. So that has certainly had some part of it, but I think it's important to note that the other side of the equation is actually the capital expenditure program, which then drives that debt level. So we're dealing with two fundamental issues here. One is the funding of operational expenditure. The other is having sufficient revenue to actually deal with your capital program and your debt levels.
Mayor Powell.
Thank you, Chair. Paul, would it be fair to say that, and this is a question around growth paying for growth or not, that the operating environment has changed so remarkably in the last 10 and certainly the last 5 years that we find ourselves in a position where the level of growth required to sustain a city that is growing as quickly as Tauranga is growing has, probably pushed aside the adage that this council may have used in the past, growth pays for growth, to the point where in fact it doesn't because it simply can't. And added to that, would you suggest that and this is apropos the question on HIF funding, that the 2% and probably going down from now, interest rates that we're getting does change and therefore give us an opportunity to manage the level of growth we've got in ways that we may need to consider quite differently to councils of the past?
Yes, I think what a lot of those models like HIF have done they've looked at the provision of financing, but haven't necessarily provided relief around some of the balance sheet constraint that actually sits with it. So I think what I would say is that, and new models on the table at the moment, such as infrastructure funding and financing, is a model that actually looks to start to move into addressing those financing issues, albeit some of the funding issues still remain. So I think it is, they continue to evolve and they will continue to evolve, and that's one thing that we want to actually continue to work with central government in terms of evolving those models going forward. And I think the other thing I'd point out in terms of the first part of your question was that the current development contribution model is very much a forward-looking model, but some of the cost pressures that we've seen have actually exceeded what would have ever been forecast at that point as well. So that's created some of that gap that's existed as well. So those things are recognised, and I think there's a lot of work going on to try and actually come up with different solutions. And we need to be part of those conversations going forward. And it'll keep coming through the course of the day, but there isn't, what I would say is there's not one solution that needs to be done. There's multiple solutions that we need to actually do to look at these issues.
Thank you. That concludes questions on that section. NZIER online at 10 o'clock, is it, or are they ready now? Okay, I think it's an opportune time. Nice little break that we'll attempt to get NZIER on Skype. If we can do that, if No, we're just going to try and get a Skype call done. But members may wish to stand up and stretch if they want to while we get... so we'll just adjourn for 3 minutes.
Okay. Christina, can you just put yourself on mute until we get to your presentation? Otherwise, we get a bit of feedback. Thank you. Are you happy for me to start? So just to provide a bit of an introduction, there is a separate report on this agenda around the impact of housing supply on the economy. So just to put this into some context, so in 2019, Tauranga City did some work which was then independently reviewed with further work by Veros to do an assessment on the amount of housing supply, residential land supply that we had, and what we were expecting to come on, what was expected to be required over the next 1 to 3 years and 4 to 10 years, and that has been separately reported, and I'll cover that when we come to that agenda item. So that gave us a pretty good steer that we actually don't have enough in the land pipeline coming on stream, particularly in the 1 to 3 years. And we started to ask ourselves questions about if that is what happens in terms of land supply, what is the overall impact of that in terms of our economy? So we commenced a conversation with Priority One about that, and I'll hand over to Nigel to pick it up from there, who's Chief Executive Priority One.
Thanks, Christine. Hi, everyone. With that background, what we did was get a report commissioned, really, as she said, into the, yes, if we're short on housing and that persists for a few years, maybe 10, what will the impact be on the overall economy? So we decided on NZIER as the best people to do that work. They're very highly qualified. And really, I think what's best is if we just hand over to Christina, who's going to present their findings. To explain it, she'll explain that very well. There are 2 scenarios which you should be aware of. So she'll talk through the methodology first and what's been happening in the housing market, and then there are a couple of scenarios to consider, both of which have the same overall effect. But she's better to explain that than me. So with that, I'll hand over to Christina.
As Nigel said, I'll quickly run through the methodology and then present our findings from the report. So in terms of how we went about estimating the impact on the economy, we started off with the estimates of the housing shortage themselves, and from that we determined, based on people per dwelling, current people per dwelling, what that means in terms of the number of people that cannot live in Tauranga as a result of not there being enough houses. So it's important to bear in mind that in estimating these effects, we're comparing it against the counterfactual of if the Tauranga economy was able to grow unconstrained in line with the demand. So that shortage is not there because there are enough houses that have increased, houses have been built to satisfy that extra demand. So that's what the effects that we've estimated capture. So in terms of how the housing shortage, what that means, first and foremost, it means that people that want to live in Tauranga cannot do so. So that's the foregone population, we can think of it as. Also, because we're not building enough houses, so based on labour productivity, the consents per person, we estimate what that means in terms of people that are in the construction industry that would not be employed because those houses are not built. From that, we estimate with the people that are not in Tauranga, what that means in terms of GDP foregone, based on GDP per capita. So because each of these people, Tauranga residents, would be producing, the fact that we have less people there means that there's less production in the Tauranga economy. Also, we go on to estimate what it means for construction GDP itself, based on the number of construction employees that are not working in Tauranga as a result of there not being those houses built. In terms of how the impact on house prices, we've drawn on 2 past cases where Tauranga has faced very tight demand, a very tight housing market. So looking at, the median days to sell give us a pretty good gauge of when the Tauranga housing market has been very tight. And we can see that from the periods 2004 and also 2013, those are when we saw very low median days to sell a house in Tauranga. And looking at what's happened over those periods, what we saw was that house prices increased whilst there was a decrease in the number of houses sold initially because there weren't enough houses being on the market. But then there's a period of adjustment where, as more supply comes on board, we do see an easing in house price growth. Now, in terms of how we apply that, we work out the house price elasticity during those periods of very tight housing market. So with that reduced number of houses being on the market, what that suggests for the increase in Tauranga house prices. And we apply that to the housing shortage to find what could be the potential increase in house prices. From that, we apply the rental yields that are in the Tauranga, currently in the Tauranga housing market to suggest what it means for the rent increase. Now, the approach that we've taken is very simple and straightforward, and is based on the assumption that the market continues over that 10-year period exactly as it is now. There is, of course, the potential, for example, because of such a severe shortage, that we have innovations in place to think about how productivity can be improved, for example, to build more houses with less number of people. However, this is beyond the scope of this report, given that there will be a lot more granular modelling required. What we've done is to illustrate if the economy was to continue as it is now, what does this housing shortage mean for the economy over in the long run there. So that's the high level description of how we've applied our methodology in terms of starting with the housing shortage and running through what that means across the different aspects of the Tauranga economy. In terms of the key findings, as Nigel mentioned, there are two different scenarios that we looked at. So firstly, the one with the housing shortage provided by Veros, and then one later on revised provided by Tauranga City Council. And we find that, for example, over that 10-year period, based on Veros's estimate of the housing shortage, 11,673 people are not able to live in Tauranga because there are not those houses there to accommodate them. In terms of what it means for GDP, by the end of the 10 years, the cumulative impact of that GDP foregone, because there are not those people living there, represents around 8.8% of Tauranga City GDP itself. In thinking about looking at the revised projections with that lower estimate of the housing shortage, it does mean in turn a smaller impact on the Tauranga economy. So based on that, we estimate that 8,436 people cannot live in Tauranga because of the housing shortage, and from that it represents 6.3% of the Tauranga GDP. Looking at the impact on house prices, now because we've applied the house price elasticity during those periods of very tight housing market, we do find that over that 10 years, based on the Veros housing shortage estimate, we estimate that prices increase by looking at the presentation there, house prices increase by, bear with me a moment, 171,481. So in terms of thinking about what this means, of course, in reality, and we've seen that firstly in the Auckland housing market, but also in periods during the Tauranga, in Tauranga as well during those past periods, what you do tend to see is that by around year 5, because house prices have increased by so much, you tend to see either a demand in terms of reduced demand because of hence unaffordability issues, and also an increase in housing supply. So I want to stress that these estimates in terms of what it means for house price increase over that 10 years represents if there was to be no reaction and no supply or demand response, and it's able to continue as it is over that 10-year period. Also, similarly for rents, we estimate this based on the current rental yields. Now, of course, as we can see in housing markets across New Zealand, what you do tend to see is that once it hits unaffordability constraints, you do tend to see rents increase more in line with income growth. Now, to the extent that this is based on how house prices have increased, we do forecast a strong increase in rents, but what is more likely is that as it bumps up on unaffordability constraints, then you'll tend to see more people adjust through, for example, more people living in each number of dwelling. And we've seen that happen in Auckland, prime example. The fact that with strong rents increase, you've tended to see more people choose to live within the single dwelling itself. So those are the key takeouts. Happy to take questions on methodology or the findings.
Thank you, Christine. Does that conclude your presentation?
Yes.
Fantastic. I'll ask my colleagues, do you have any questions of the presentation? Councillor Arbery, then Councillor Clout.
So what's your best estimate for increase in rental prices over the next 3 years, assuming we don't get these housing supply online?
Yeah, so if we were just, for example, to look at the Tauranga City Council estimate of how of the housing shortage, we estimate that mean rents, this is the mean, the average rents increased by 500 over that 10-year period. So based on the rental yield and the fact that it's increasing steadily because we've applied elasticity to it, then you would say that it's around $50 per year, roughly, mean rents.
Councillor Clout.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the analysis. I guess as a decision maker here, I'm really struggling with the relevance of these figures, given that you've already said that these are theoretical increases in rents and prices over 10 years, which are never actually going to happen in reality. So it's not particularly helpful to me is all I'm saying, this information.
If this housing shortage was to continue as it is. But looking at past experiences and prime example being in Auckland, what you do tend to see is that prices become a signal for the allocation of resources. So usually it's around the 5-year mark that as much as the housing market can sustain such tightness in the market, and because prices have increased so much, it's a signal for example, developers because it becomes more feasible for developments, housing developments to come on board. So you do tend to see that with strong price increases, there is increase in supply that comes on board in response to that. So when you look at past experiences and also Auckland, around 5 years, so if you look at where we've put the ceiling at, it is around, although we've estimated over that whole 10-year period, it is, we do expect that around the 5-year mark, we do tend to see a response either through reduced demand or increased supply. And usually you do see it more for increased supply.
Councillor Clout, you're an intelligent and an articulate member. I'd be most grateful if you could phrase your comment as a question next time. But do you have a supplementary question? No? Thank you. Any additional questions, colleagues? No, thank you for the presentation, Christine, and for Skyping into Tauranga this morning. Are there any follow-up matters from Tauranga City Council staff? Christine Jones.
Picking up on the question from Councillor Clout, the relevance of this is that you're having a conversation around your capital program and prioritisation of the capital program. If the council is unable to, within its balance sheet's constraints, deliver the infrastructure that's required for growth, the developers will not be able to bring that additional housing supply on stream, and then you will have these economic and house price consequences as a result. So we're really trying to provide you some information around what happens if expenditure is prioritised to an extent that it means that the growth can't come on stream. But also the other relevance of this is part of, we'll talk about later on, is engaging with central government and regional government and having some real data around the consequences if we can't find a way through these issues is really useful for the conversation, because then it's much more meaningful and relevant.
Thank you. So that concludes this section of the agenda. Folks, I've been informed that Matt Kelley, Chief Executive of the Chamber of Commerce, is available to answer any questions from the Chamber of Commerce's perspective on this morning's agenda, but he has some diary constraints. So what we'll do is we will now move to Paul's next part of his presentation. But if you have any questions for the Chamber of Commerce, if you could be thinking about that in the back of your mind, we will then, just before morning tea, see whether we can get Matt Kelley to answer those. Over to you, Paul. I think we're ready to conclude the Skype call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just skipping to the next section of the presentation, which is what's changed since the December when we brought to you the first cut of the draft annual plan, which seems like a very long time ago now. So back in December, what we brought to you were options around a 5.7% increase compared to the long-term plan of just over 8%. And options around risk reserve funding. In the current plan, we have 1 million, as we'll allude to later. That reserve is in deficit at the moment, but to increase that funding to 4.4 million, I think what we said in December was that the issues really are fundamentally need to be addressed as part of the long-term plan, and we'll work through the annual plan to get to that position. However, the big issues were remaining within that long-term plan conversation, sort of commencing immediately once the annual plan's concluded. So what was resolved at that point was to continue the movement in the UAGC and the differential as per the long-term plan. So that was a reduction in the UAGC, the third step in the reduction down to 15%, and the differential going up to the commercial differential to 1.2%. So that was a 3-year step that was introduced as part of the last long-term plan. And then a resolution to include average residential rates at 2% plus CPI, which was forecast at 1.9, giving a 3.9, and we left the decision around the risk reserve funding on the table. So what's happened since December, as I alluded to earlier, is that there's been a significant change in that cost structure. I've highlighted some of these in the presentation. So Waiyari has increased from its original estimate. That's based on additional planning, additional design work, and additional information coming through tender processes. We've had updated advice on some of our weather-tight exposure. As you're aware, we've provided for this through our annual report for a number of years, but the level of that provision is now predicted to be insufficient to actually deal with the amount of liability that's coming through there. And then there are other capital adjustments that are yet to be made, which Councillor Arbery alluded to earlier in terms of that $500 million to $1 billion issue, particularly in some of our growth waters and some of the costings within there, some of the resilience work, and not all of the BVL investment program is included within that. The other major item that's happened is our elder housing divestment was originally budgeted in the next annual plan year. That's been pushed back a period of time. That's a current value of around $23 million impacting on debt as well. So all of those things have actually been put together. It actually has been what the significant change has happened since December, which is why we're now coming back to you to say effectively we need to start addressing some of these more major issues through this annual plan process, which will then obviously continue and inform a conversation into the long-term plan. So on the changes from December, I'll just pause for any questions on.
Questions on what has happened since December? Any questions from members? Councillor Robson?
One of the judgments that our community has to make is the quality of the decision making around this table. Which of those changes has been a function of the decision making around this table? Obviously the timing of the elder housing divestment was a conscious decision made by this table. But those 4 other factors, the change in the cost structure at Waiyari, the updated advice on the value of the weather-tight claim, and the issues around other capital program adjustments, is it fair to say that they're not the function of current decision making?
Yes, that's fair to say. Those projects have been included, and it's other factors driving the costs.
Supplementary, if I may, if we reversed the decision on the timing of the elder housing divestment, what would the impact be? Because it is difficult to understand the rationale for postponing it as it's outlined in our report, but what would be the impact of reversing that delayed decision?
A number of things. One is in terms of the long-term implications, which I'll come to and show you the slide that what that looks like into the future will be a matter of timing. So it's largely whether what goes into the long-term plan, what is in the annual plan, but that the decision is still to be made in terms of that financial sustainability. The other one Christine can probably add to is in terms of the rationale behind the delay in the decision is to ensure the best possible outcome for the city, the community, the residents of those villages. And to work through that process properly will take more time than what was originally planned.
I can just add to that, it is about going through that in a robust way. It's a comprehensive and a complicated decision, but the other factor is with the residential intensification plan changes, that will enable a better quality, a different quality product on the ground in terms of the redevelopment of those sites, but also opportunity for a bit of a role model, and also to get greater number of housing dwellings on those sites. For that to happen, that plan change needs to be further ahead prior to you taking it through any divestment process, so that those people who are putting bids in for that have got a high level of certainty about the opportunities that they'll have on those sites.
Councillor Baldock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might need your indulgence just to go back a little bit beyond December with this question, but I think it would be useful probably to go on the whiteboard. But because differentials are a big part of the discussion today, or some of the issues coming up, in 2018 in the LTP, what, Paul, was the differential we actually went out to the community to consult on? And what was the overall rate increase that we went out to consult on? If those two things could be brought to us later, or if you know off the top of your head, you can tell us now.
So it was 1.6 was the differential we consulted on. I'd have to confirm back the rating level at that point. They will have to come back on that. And then the decision was to actually reduce that to 1.2, introduced over 3 years.
Any additional questions, colleagues? No, just inviting any questions of the Chamber of Commerce on this morning's agenda. Councillor Clout. Chief Executive Matt, if you, take the chair, thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for coming along and showing a keen interest in our discussion, because obviously it's got a big impact on the business community. So I guess the fairly obvious question is, if we are to seriously look at a fairly substantial increase in the commercial differential, what impact will that have on local businesses, both big and small?
Kia ora koutou, and thank you very much, Chair, for being so obliging. I noticed the Wi-Fi password's changed since I was last in this. Look, thank you very much. Good question. Look, if you look holistically, just at the council charges on a lot of SMEs, particularly if you take anyone in any of the four Main Street organisations, you've got the general rate with the commercial differential included, you've got the economic development targeted rate, you've got the charge for the Main Street entities themselves, as well as a whole heap of user fees and charges, including licence to occupy, sanitation checks, and a whole bunch of raft of things. So when you look holistically, of course, a lot of these people don't own their buildings. They do rent them, and of course with rents being quite a contentious issue, with businesses facing a huge amount of fixed costs, combined with increasing costs of suppliers, combined with the soon to be implemented from the 1st of April, a whole bunch of staffing resources costs with the minimum wage going up and Holiday Act changes and other things. Added in a hyper-competitive marketplace where the ability to increase revenue is severely limited with these increasing costs. You would have to question the polluter benefactor principle as part of through these targeted rates and levies, because we can't forget that a lot of these business owners are also ratepayers too, so they're essentially paying twice. We also need to consider the fact that, excuse me if I'm taking too long to answer this question, the fact that, where was I going? There is a lot of lost productivity at the moment, particularly with the transport, with staff being stuck in gridlock traffic. So least time on site, their ability to actually be productive and charge out, is a significant issue for businesses, as well as there's a lot of freight that's been stuck in traffic likewise. So there is, once, if there was a plan, and if there was confidence that the plan would be executed, I'd say the commercial sector would be obliging, because they've got current costs, and if you're able to alleviate those costs with a solid plan, the conversation would be quite robust. There is no plan, there is no confidence that the plan will be executed. Therefore, the confidence in the business community to increase rates, to subsidise, lift the burden from the residential ratepayers, which they're also contributing to as well, would be limited.
Councillor Baldock. Thank you, Matt. I guess the question is, though, none of these other costs are going to go away immediately. We need the business community to take the long-term view, to take what we need to impose, knowing it will solve things, and they have every right to ask about certainty. But will the community, come along with us on this journey? It's a big challenge to get the revenue up, and not a short-term mentality. Which is what happened 2 years ago. You may have been around to notice that we had a huge reaction about the change of a 1.6 differential. So will they do that? Will they not take a short-term view, but take this journey with us?
Oh, look, what was finally resolved by previous councils, I don't see you, it will be unlikely to get a lot of friction with what's currently resolved from previous councils. Doing a knee-jerk reaction in this annual plan out of context of the wider view in the next few weeks before you go out for consultation would be incredibly knee-jerk, and it wouldn't be beneficial to building up the long-term trust. Yeah, well, once again, former Mayor Crosby, now regional councillor, had an editorial in the Bay of Plenty Times last year talking about the millions that have been squandered on developing plans, meanwhile the execution has been lacking. And I remember being around these tables with in 13 to 16 and seeing the amount of money that was going into traffic modelling, and we're just conscious of the execution just hasn't been there.
The dry wit of Councillor Crosby. Mayor Powell, question.
Thank you, Chair. Matt, thanks for coming in, really appreciate it. Just on exactly that topic, really, do you think that there would be a greater acceptance by the business community, both small business owners and larger corporations, if we were just to get on, explain the plan, based on a lot of the planning which has been done, the vast majority of which, in my view, whether it's transport, AFTI, smart growth, housing, is actually not too bad, but if we then, cracked on and just executed those plans, there would be greater acceptance?
Oh, look, in my opinion, the issue isn't with AFTI, it isn't with smart growth, it is the execution around the three local as well as the central government agencies, and I suppose it's the delivery of some pretty noticeable projects, the Durham Streets, the Harrington Car Park, and a number of things. Can't execute some single, relatively simple in the scheme of things projects. The faith in delivering and some much broader, wider transport networks is yet to be seen.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Arbery, and then final question, Councillor Hughes.
Yeah, thanks for that. I've got I suppose it's a yard nearby me that's got about a fleet of 15 to 20 trucks, but their rateable value is actually less than the average residential house. We also have a new industrial player going in, and they're going to be discharging hundreds of litres a second of wastewater. So currently we're charging them per toilet installed, not in terms of what the actual cost is on our infrastructure. And we're also charging the yard. They've got trucks running, throughout the day, and they cause a lot more damage to our roads. So we charge them 1.2 times maybe what the average residential ratepayer is paying. Is there some, or is that fair, I suppose, or would the business community be open to looking at other ways to charge or to get rates back?
Great. Oh, look, and I'm sure there's anecdotes in and around the city in both residential and commercial. I suppose the benefit of having a simple tax or a revenue system is that it's easy to administer. I'm sure there's going to be a few unders and overs right across the community in many different aspects. It's around what is efficient for you to deliver, collect those rates and make sure it's as fair and efficient as possible. But speaking about the individual situation, I'm sure there's lots of examples across the city in many different cases, including residential, that there's a few loopholes.
Councillor Hughes.
Hi, Matt. Yeah, I just wondered if you could speak to the rates differential as it is in other cities. Sometimes when you look at these tables, they can look differently however way you swing it, and you're talking about different targeted rates that are also hitting our commercial ratepayers. Have you done some work around differentials in other cities and how we line up based on the full package of rates that our commercial people are having to pay?
That largely depends on the decisions that are made around this table. If it's going through as currently proposed, the need for us to do that level of work would be more of a monitoring work, as opposed to doing a thorough investigation. If certain things, if there's suggestions of it changing dramatically, there will be more thorough research that will be done.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for making yourself available for members' questions. We'll now move, Paul, to the next section. I'm thinking, members, that we will break around 10:45 and have 15 minutes, and then we'll be on to another presentation via Skype at 11. So, Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what does all this mean? Just in terms of some of the large financial risks and changes that this creates. First point is that the existing capital program that we have predicted in our long-term plan isn't financially sustainable. Now that's based on, as I said earlier, that we haven't actually done a full long-term planning process, but what we do know is that we have the previous long-term plan which has been updated for what we know, and there are still some significant gaps in that. So that comes back to that $500 million to $1 billion, which you'll see in the slide shortly. Current funding and financing options, we can't do all the work that's needed, so there's significant prioritisation that needs to occur with that. Our balance sheet capacity is significantly reduced, and current limit at 250%, which I'll come back to in a second. We're getting very close to that limit. We're not actually breaching it in the annual plan year, but we get to the point where we're extremely close to that limit based on the full 250%. Just to explain a little bit more on that ratio, currently the local government funding agency is our source of borrowing. It's been in place for a number of years now. It offers us significant favourable rates at close to central government credit ratings. It does have some stipulations around it though. Those stipulations are quite, they're very black and white in terms of 250% for us. So our revenue level in any one year can only provide capacity for debt at 2.5 times that revenue level. Breaching it does mean a significant implication. The most immediate is in the vicinity of $1.7 million of higher interest rates based on the work we've done in terms of modelling what we would need to do in terms of re-borrowing that debt, and that debt would continue to increase. That gap would continue to increase on a yearly basis as we borrowed more. hence it's not a recommended option. Our capital for the next few years will see us, so we won't, as I said, it won't breach in the annual plan year, but it breaches at this point very shortly afterwards. Standard & Poor's currently, so in the last 2 years we've moved from an A+ rating to a AA- rating. The commentary that existed around the last AA- rating was fairly strong in the sense that they recognise the issues that exist and the pressures that exist, and that rating is, there's a high probability that there will be a change in that rating, particularly depending on what direction we set through both the annual plan and the long-term plan. I mentioned earlier new tools. The new tools are in play, but again it comes back to the fact that there's not one that sits on their own that will actually solve this. For example, infrastructure funding and financing has some options, and we've done some work around that, and at this point it's looking in the vicinity of $100 million of option that would provide. However, it still needs to be funded by people, so it's a financing tool very much so. In terms of actual risk reserves, so our current risk reserve is in deficit. Now, just important to point out, it's not in a cash deficit, it's in an accrual deficit. So meaning of that is that we have significant exposure around some of our leaky home claims. They haven't realised yet. Provision is defined as more likely rather than less likely, so it is more likely rather than less likely that it will end up in a deficit. What that means is we need to borrow to fund that. Further increase in the quantified risk since December, so that again comes back to talking about leaky homes is the major one that exists there, and we've seen significant, particularly around the multi-unit claims, of exposure in that area. The more and more the more work that goes into actually on the capital program, and the more refinement of design, and Waiau is a good example of this, is actually cost increasing. So we're seeing a significant amount of that happening. I suspect it will continue through the long-term plan, would be a fair assumption to make, so there will be more pressure on that number. Very conscious of actually the ability to deliver. It's a common question that comes up in terms of both the organisation and the sector's ability to deliver. That means two things. One is we need to be positioned to do it, but the sector also needs to be, and pure supply demand means that is actually having an impact on cost as well. There's simply more work out there than actually can be delivered, which is putting more pressure on that cost structure. One of the recommendations that we're saying is 225% in terms of that ratio, for two fundamental reasons. One is consistent with the past, which we've said 225 always gives you an element of buffer for things that go wrong. So, for example, the May 2005 storms impacted on Council's balance sheet in the tune of $85 million of stormwater works that's resulted from that. That buffer is for those unexpected things that happen with that. Probably what has changed in that regard, though, is as we've moved into predicting into the long-term plan, the more buffer we have there, the more capacity we have to actually have the conversations in the long-term plan. So there are two elements at play within that ratio now. Just in terms of graphically what that looks like, it's a fairly confused chart, but this option is actually showing it at the option 2, so the 8.8 or net 7.6% rate increase. Just to explain to go from left to the right of the page, the green charts are where we've delivered capital expenditure for the last year and the current budget year, just over 200 million. Currently in our system we have in 2021 a budget of 249 million. You can see the level of escalation that occurs over that. Now, some of that has been because we've pushed things out because we just can't do them within there. So the average is north of 300 million in terms of the next 4 years beyond that in terms of our capital program. So left unchecked, at that revenue level, the green line shows what it does to our ratio, blowing out in the 2022 year, exceeding that ratio. What that would mean is if we published an annual plan or a long-term plan with that position in place, one, we most likely will have some qualification from Audit New Zealand. The other would be is that at that point we would not be able to borrow further from LGFA. In the event we breach, we have to repay debt from LGFA. So that's the ordering of events that occurs on that particular line. So the yellow columns then show what the capital program would need to reduce by in order to actually keep us around that 225% line, and these are reflected in the options. But what the impact of that is at $500 million. And the reason we're saying $500 million to $1 billion is because we know that there are other things, like I said before, some of those growth projects, some of those BVL projects aren't included in these numbers at this point. So we haven't done the work around what the total would look like, but we know it is in the vicinity of we know it's $500 million, and it's potentially up to $1 billion in that. But you can see even at $500 million, the numbers simply don't line up within that chart. And then what that looks like in terms of introducing some sort of debt management. This is moving into option 3 in your report. You can see it does give some extra capacity to be delivered in the capital program in terms of up around just over 200 million in terms of a sustainable program, but it does not resolve all the issues. Those issues still exist in the long-term plan and still will need to be worked through within the long-term plan, and that's where we want to move in those bigger conversations at a sub-regional, regional and national level in terms of an indication that the models are simply not able to deliver what is needed for a growth city of this size, particularly when you see what we would need to actually remove out of long-term plans based on those numbers. Okay, so another pause.
Pause for Paul and questions, colleagues, on that section. Going from my right again, Councillor Baldock, then Councillor Robson.
Pleased I've moved to your right. That's good. Paul, can we have a, you may give it or we may wait, it may be whiteboarded for Mohan later, but reserve, Federal Reserve, slashing interest rates and so on, the effect of the virus. So we should know if there's any expectation that we may benefit from any lower interest rates within the next annual plan period, and whether, even between draft to setting the rates in June, whether we may see some figures come through that would give us any understanding of how that may affect what we're doing.
Sure, so I'll answer the question, and if there's anything further that Mohan can add to, but yeah, as you refer to, the Federal Reserve cut 0.5% last night. Australian Reserve has cut as well. The forecast at the moment is that we will be seeing 2 interest rate cuts, and I suspect one of them will be relatively soon. The big issue with the interest rate market at the moment will be is, one, there isn't a lot of room to move further down. We're at 1% OCR, so it won't be significant in terms of what that looks like. The other is in terms of most of our borrowing is based on a repayment period of the life of assets as much as we can closely resemble. So our debt retirement works on 25 years for a big chunk of our asset structure. Now, the implications of actually moving debt levels up are quite clear in terms of, as Mark, we will recover from the current situation. There will be some recovery of the economy in the future. Those rates will go north, and that will create a level of exposure that we just need to be very carefully to monitor what that would look like at some time in the future, because it will be within that 25-year window. It more than likely will be longer than what was initially planned, and you'll more likely see some reduction in the near term in terms of those rates. I don't know, Mohan, if you wanted to comment any further what negative interest rates might mean for us.
I think what's happened the last 2 days, that rate reductions, expectation is our Reserve Bank will cut, and that it's worth about 330,000 a quarter for 0.25% for us, if they do it on the 25th. So there is a reduction in average rate based on that.
If I can, yeah, like how quickly it flows through to the LGFA, and I mean the figure you're giving us is something that could be a little saving coming through for a short period of time, perhaps.
Correct, yeah.
Councillor Robson.
2 questions, if I may, one in the supplementary. In the context of $330,000 a quarter, what was the increase in the leaky homes provision? Can you put a number to that in the public domain? It's been referred to a number of times in this presentation as a significant move in our debt provision. in our debt situation via provisions. Can you put a number to how big that movement's been?
So through the chair, we've allowed for an additional 25 million. It's fair to say that there's still significant potential movement within that number.
Okay. Supplementary, if I may, and it goes to the charts you put up there. We have this situation, just to contextualise, Chair, we have a situation where we talk about debt to revenue ratio, but there are different types of revenue. So just as a for instance, if we introduced curbside recycling and charged our residents $300 a household, 60,000 rating units, $18 million a year, that revenue of $18 million a year would enable us to raise our debt ceiling by $45 million using the 2.5 multiplier. Is that correct?
That's correct, and it's factored into our numbers, yes.
However, that $18 million a year would be offset by probably $18 million at least of expenditure paying for contractors and bins and maintenance and management and all the rest of it. That's a very different scenario to whacking $300 a household onto a debt reduction levy, which doesn't have any offsetting operational expenditure. Is that correct?
That's correct. The addition of the debt retirement, however, does, without any expenditure, means that it hits both the numerator and the denominator in terms of it purely goes to debt reduction. So debt reduction goes up and debt reduction reduces debt, revenue increases, as opposed to the other example with an expenditure component. It's obviously got no debt impact.
So if one had a choice, one would look to increase revenue that didn't have an offsetting OPEX. Is that correct?
It's an option sitting with elected members that would allow that to occur through the debt management.
Thank you.
Councillor Baldock.
I think Councillor Robson is raising a good point. I just want to get it clarified. So actually our options would be the debt management 5%, which is being recommended between option 3 and 4, which does more to reduce the debt to revenue ratio than something like curbside collection. Just clarifying.
That's correct. One, it increases revenue. Secondly, it reduces debt. Thirdly, it compounds.
Additional questions, Mayor Powell?
Just a supplementary to all of that, I think, Paul, at the end of the day, if I'm correct, what you're saying is we've got to find a way of getting the numerator and the denominator to stop going north and south of each other and bring them back closer together, and that is obviously going to be a mix of revenue and debt management. Is that correct?
Is correct.
Any further questions, colleagues, before we break for morning tea? Councillor Clout.
Thank you, Paul. There are often suggestions to us that we can get very, very cheap money from offshore, presumably less than the LGFA charge us. Have we as an organisation really explored that to any great degree? And if so, what are the results and are there risks associated with that? Because it certainly sounds appealing and would be worth looking at.
I'll ask Mohan to answer that.
The legislation prohibits councils, except for Auckland Council and LGFA, borrow offshore in a foreign currency. So we can only borrow in New Zealand dollars. Non-residents can lend to us, but has to be here. But there are no rates lower than LGFA. Offshore you might borrow in yen or other currencies, but you run the currency risk when you convert back to New Zealand dollars. So you end up with a New Zealand dollar rate because we can't borrow in other currencies. Yep.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. We will adjourn now. Oh, sorry, yes, Mayor Powell. Yep.
Supplementary to that, while that is technically quite right that we can't, there are sources available to do it if we could, and I have explored them just theoretically. They are available. The point, though, that I think we should be at, we can discuss this on the whiteboard, Chair, if we may later on, is there are sources here in New Zealand and in the Western Bay of Plenty that we should be looking at that do have the ability to fund many of our social and infrastructure projects that we should be doing in partnership with. From my perspective, the council should have been doing it in partnership with these entities some time ago, but we absolutely now, because of the partnership we have with Regional and Western Bay Plenty District Council, to do that as part of a Western Bay Plenty funding play for a number of off-balance sheet opportunities.
Thank you. I'll take that as a fulsome answer to Councillor Clout's question. Colleagues, we will now adjourn until 11 o'clock, and when we return at 11 o'clock, we'll have the Skype ready to go, and we'll have an Infrastructure New Zealand presentation. Okay, we've reconvened the meeting, colleagues. And on the line, we have Paul Blair from Infrastructure New Zealand to give his presentation. Colleagues, we'll receive these reports at the end when we get into decision making. So we're just doing the presentations and questions now. Paul will give his presentation about 20 odd minutes, and then we'll have time for questions after that. Over to Christine. Do you want to introduce? No, straight over to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll flick through this presentation quite quickly. For context, this presentation was given on the 14th of February to the LGNZ Metro meeting earlier in the month, and what it is really it's our vision, which we presented at our conference in Rotorua in August last year, for how we might reform the planning, funding and governance framework that sits between local and central government in a way that we can get better outcomes. That's the very short brief. This is all on our website, but Robin, if you could move through just to our vision slide for me, the third one. So these 5 criteria that you'll see up on screen are what we've seen consistently around the globe in terms of what we need to get world-class infrastructure. And I think what our proposal intends to do is to try and hit all of those 5 boxes. If you've only got 4, you don't get it done. But as you folk will know as governors and leaders, probably the most critical one is the vision and the leadership. That's that number 1, because you can get the other ones changed. If you move on to slide 5 for me, Robin, this is the ownership and funding of New Zealand's infrastructure. These are our figures. They haven't really been seen before. It won't be a surprise to you, but that local government ownership of 114 billion, or about 38% of New Zealand's infrastructure, is only supported on the right-hand side by about 10% of the total government revenue take. So central government's 137 billion on the left-hand side of assets is 42% of the total, and 90% of the total government revenue take. In the middle there, we've done a quick stock take of how we think things are performing using those 5 pillars that I showed you on slide 1. And it's not surprising that the private sector stuff is doing pretty well, and then we get into more pressured areas which you guys control. If you can move to the next slide, what we're talking about in this building regions pitch is called either a city deal or a regional deal overseas. I'll come to it later, but in effect, what it says is that instead of 10 cents in the dollar, local government should get a higher share of that by working in partnership with the central government around a spatial plan in a co-governed way, in order that the bottom-up needs of communities, iwi and business, particularly with the RMA framework in New Zealand, so that bottom-up need meets the top-down needs of our national government, and that we work in partnership together. So, but at our conference, you'll see 98% of our delegates, and we had 720 in Rotorua last year, supported a city or regional deal framework, and 93% supported increased local government powers as well. What this is about, though, is we also support localism, which is the LGNZ sort of policy position, but we just don't think it's practical that we'll leap to localism in New Zealand without an interim stage. That's what this is about. If you flip on to the next one about the problem area, I'm just going to race through this. There are more problems, and I'm trying to keep upbeat on this, but we're all about balancing the books rather than the outcomes. You know that growth benefits flow centrally and you can only recover your costs. Centralised decision making in a world that's more complex just is not an agile way to make decisions. You need to make them closer to the customers, the ratepayers and the people. And that there is a real mix of local and also national costs and benefits. So though we like to say, well, local government, that's yours, or central government, that's yours, in practical reality, we both have obligations here and it's all a bit mixed up. The next slide is around a perception of a lack of capability and capacity in local government. And I only raise this with you not to be provocative, but this is what I hear is the biggest barrier to getting a partnership deal done with local government, is this perception. It's about economies of scale. It's about the fact that, really you've got sort of 1 year funding facing infrastructure needs that are 30, 50-year assets. So I'll come back to that capability and capacity thing later on, because I think that it's critical if we're going to get any partnership with central government that we address this, and we've got some ideas there. The next slide is about oversight and accountability. You would have seen the Auditor General's report on the water sector. Central government isn't blameless in this space either. They are not doing particularly well, and they don't always have. They are judge and jury in some cases. Accountabilities are unclear, and all central politicians will privately say that a 3-year electoral cycle massively hampers them, along with the MMP, from delivering for 30 or 50-year needs. So that is the state of government that we have today. A big bit of our report is why do we always get internationally recognised for amazing government, transparency, accountability, etc., but some of our outcomes are pretty poor. So we think the answer is in more partnership and clarity. I will skip, if you could skip right through towards the piece in the building regions bit at the back, Robin. So this report, which we have on our website, it's on the right-hand side there, it's all downloadable. Please feel free to have a read, and I'd love to hear feedback from you. But at high level, we're talking about generating a sort of a fund or a grant. I want to critically say that unlike the Provincial Growth Fund, which we think has done some good things, there are some things in there that you would argue are more political than great outcomes, but there are some good things being done there. What we're looking for is a formula or a framework. Certain cents in the dollar are paid from central collection into a new form of regional government with local government at that table. I'll explain that coming forward. The second thing, I was at an Infrastructure Commission event on Friday. All stripes of political parties are agreeing that spatial planning is the way to go. For spatial planning to work, it's not going to work with 78 councils. It needs to work with a lesser number of regions. In the back of this report, we have a few different ideas on what regions might be. But I think the critical thing is that we have one definition across the country. So instead of maybe 20 DHBs and I don't know, 10 NZTA regions, we have one definition. And locals play a big part in self-identifying which regions those are. We just think they should be of a certain economic scale. The third point is really, I think, the critical opener of a possibility for a partnership. So local government New Zealand has a measure, I think it's called Council Mark, for how well you spend money and how well you look after ratepayers' dollars, and that's very important. But it's different to what the central government use. So they use this Treasury Investor Confidence Rating. It gives out an A, B, C or D rating. So NZTA, for example, which has been through a few troubles lately, dropped from a B rating to a C rating. That C rating means that they get less delegated authority and less money sent to them. The opportunity, I think, for Tauranga, and I would prefer that it be called the Bay of Plenty or some larger region, is that you enter into this framework. You use this as a partnership framework for you to get on the same page as central government. And what that means is that instead of talking Swahili to their Russian, we're both talking the same language. If Tauranga or the wider Bay of Plenty were able to get a C rating, the great advantage is that you can say to Grant Robertson, well, if you give me $1, I'll spend it as well as NZTA. And if you do that in a spatial partnership, then 1 + 1 is genuinely going to equal 3, where at the moment, in my perception, 1 + 1 is equaling about, 1.5. We're actually wasting money through our current framework of local and central interaction, unfortunately. Point 4, alignment of goals. Point 5, we think that particularly for water and for transport, both of which enable housing, obviously, we think that regional scale matters. And we think that using regions is helpful. City deals are great, but they introduce a city v country issue. If we talk regions, then the hinterland benefits from the city and the city benefits from the hinterland. We have some cross-subsidisation. We don't have an us and them. We don't have I live in Auckland and I'm getting all the toys and nothing in the hinterland. So I think that's important. And as I said earlier at point 6, there are further things that we could do around special economic zones or localism later on, but I think we've got to start from a better base than we've got today. So if you could shift over to the next slide, Robin. That's just one example. We suggested 10 regions, we suggested 5, we suggested 14 or 19. We're sort of not fussed, so long as individuals in those areas get to choose which region they self-identify with, and they have to be large enough to be economically feasible. If you could go to the next slide, this is the final slide I'll talk through. I used an example of a Waikato plan. So set up a Waikato regional partnership and firstly come up with a 2050 vision. We are going hard at central government for the fact that you are required to have a 30-year vision, but central government does not. Our first policy priority for this year is that we start a discussion with lots of other individuals and peak bodies and businesses about getting a vision for New Zealand, not an infrastructure vision, a vision of what lifestyle we want for our children in 30 years' time across the wellbeing framework. So set up a 2050 vision and get co-governance. So get all of the 11 TLAs in Waikato and find a representative sample, which will be a challenge. Get Tainui at the table, representative sample also of the iwi interest in that region. That's also going to be a challenge to get full representation. But bring to that table NZTA, Ministry of Education, Kāinga Ora, and maybe one or two others. Second thing, that spatial plan translates the vision, and then we get actually down to the strategy of how and where are we going to build homes, put jobs, roads, hospitals, etc. And we're all on one page with that. The third one is basically that thing that you see in the paper every day, that the Crown can borrow money cheaply and it can actually turn it into equity. So what we're talking about is the Crown giving a grant of 100 million. It's not a HIF, it's not a debt, it's a grant of 100 million. It's a 10-year grant, so it provides certainty of funding to that Waikato partnership. And because it's income, Paul Davidson there can go and borrow at least 2.5 times that to introduce some more money into the system. So 2.5 times that is great. The final sentence at number 3 is introducing the idea that with that now 350 million that we've got to invest in infrastructure, we invest it in pipes and roads that enable housing. That $50,000 infrastructure per home is the Productivity Commission's estimate New Zealand-wide for the cost of those pipes and roads. I'm sure that there's flex in growth areas like yours above that, but I'm using that for example. At number 4, a basic home these days is 150 square metres, and you're very lucky if you get away with $2,000 a square metre. But 150 square metre home at $2,000 a square metre is $300,000. $300,000 divided by $50,000 is further leverage, if you like, of 6 to 1. And obviously, if you're going to have a larger home or a higher spec home, you're going to get much more leverage. That is the crowding in of private investment on which GST, of course, is payable. So at the lower level here, what you see is the Crown for its $100 is getting 8.5 times leverage, and its $100 million that it's put in as a grant is achieving $367 million worth of GST alone. That ignores corporate taxes, it ignores personal taxes, it ignores productivity benefits. It also, for the purposes of keeping it simple, ignores their need to go and put in hospitals, trunk roads, etc. But my core point, and you guys are facing this today, is that it is economically advantageous, given a 90-10 split, for the Crown to be involved in urban development. My final point on the bottom one there is that C, investor confidence rating. And again, Paul Davidson there would be able to go and enter into some 10-year contracts. You would have seen that Watercare in Auckland has entered into an enterprise agreement which is targeting 20% procurement savings. I've chosen 10. That's another massive saving that's available to be reinvested in quality infrastructure. So I've gone through that very quickly, the values in the Q&A, but what we've tried to do is, you see those tick boxes, is we've tried to tick how we would create a new system, a self-regulating system that would tick all of the 5 pillars that we see for world-class infrastructure. I've deliberately kept it high level and there's lots of what-ifs, but I'd like to sort of pause there and take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Paul. Questions, colleagues? Councillor Clout.
Thank you very much, Paul. Really appreciate the work that Infrastructure New Zealand is doing, and I really applaud your latest report and your recommendations. So I've just got 2 questions. The first one is, there's talk that the Productivity Commission recommendations to government have been watered down, and I'm just interested in knowing Infrastructure New Zealand's view on the latest recommendations from the Productivity Commission, and also aligned with that is the issue of commercial rating differentials. That's my first question.
Sure. I just completed a survey to the Productivity Commission. I was a little underwhelmed with the Productivity Commission's report. I don't think they had the right scope of question, but it's not their gift to have the right scope of question. I think the right scope of question would have been, what is required in order for local government to be highly successful? Yes, rates are an efficient tool, but that really wasn't the question for me. I met with Minister Woods on Monday, and I talked hard about the urban growth partnerships, which in effect is a building regions type proposal. She seemed to say that we're in the same sort of a place on what we're wanting to talk about with building regions and or urban growth partnerships. But she also held back a bit to say, look, the Productivity Commission recommendations also need to be responded to. There was some good stuff in there, some idea of sort of GST sort of returning to the regions in order to create incentives. There was some good stuff about central government paying its share in terms of the rating holiday it gets from you guys. I can't really comment about the commercial rating differential, but I think it'd be that similar theme of, the benefits tend to flow to Wellington rather than locally.
Thank you, Paul. My second question relates to the emphasis you've put on regional cooperation, and I think that's another very laudable objective. One of your slides there said that it doesn't require amalgamation of councils. Can you just elaborate on your view on that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, amalgamation doesn't work in New Zealand. It won't work. And actually, as I said before, I do fundamentally believe in localism. I think that, you get a better outcome for ratepayers or customers when decisions happen closer to them. In Auckland, there was a review of the governance here, and broadly the governance has worked well, and then going up to a unitary type level. So they were able to generate some value out of that. But that has been partly at the expense of local boards, which are underfunded to actually deliver for local residents. So we are not pushing for amalgamation in any way. We think that there are savings to be had from cooperating in particularly regional water and transport, which will enable housing, and that those savings could and should be recycled back into more local responsiveness towards being community councils and towards meeting needs of local residents. I also think that some of those services in time, that are provided by central government should be provided more locally. But I think we've got to walk before we run with that. But I think that if we take water as an example, and there's some pretty high profile failings going on around the place at present, I can see 2 ways that the central government might respond to this. They might create a water fund, and that will enable some very, very small councils to perpetuate their business model, which isn't working for New Zealand. Or I think that we could use a carrot approach and give a percentage of national income, which is what we're talking about here, in return for regional consolidation of some services. But that still leaves all of those local councils in place, but with a more local focused role.
Thank you very much, Paul. Really appreciate your work and looking forward to dealing more closely with you in future. Thank you.
Next, I've got the Mayor, then Councillor Arbery.
Paul, thank you very much, and this makes perfect, in fact, it's music to my ears, as I'm sure you're aware, in pretty much every regard, and we certainly have the ability to do that here. We're working towards it and have been for a while with the Western Bay of Plenty District Council, with the Bay of Plenty Regional Council, and critically with iwi as a part of the challenge we have here, and this is partly my question, is that unlike Tainui and the Waikato, we have 3 major iwi here that don't necessarily agree on the way things would be divided up locally. And I think the opportunity for us is to bring everybody into the fold. The work that you've done in Waikato, this is the model that I campaigned on, a model very similar to this, and I'd advocate for it hugely here today. The process to get to this point, and to get to this point with central government, would have taken some time across at the Waikato. So I presume that you're available to come and meet with us all and talk us through the process that is the best way to achieve this, given the differences at the Bay of Plenty than the Waikato, the linkages between the two being critically important.
And so I chose the Waikato as an example. I don't think the Waikato is there yet. I think that what they're looking at more is sort of that Hamilton-Auckland corridor and adding a couple of other local authorities in there. I mean, I'd advocate for what we've got, but then again, the Hamilton-Auckland corridor or urban partnership seems to be the thing that's on offer at the moment. In terms of iwi participation, this is a sort of quite a vexed area, and one where there's some pretty high emotion. I won't pretend to have the answers here, but I do like the independent Maori statutory board approach that Auckland has taken, which is one where I think there's 13 iwi in the Tamaki collective here. The opportunity has been put back to that collective to say, well, how would you like to represent the views of the 13 at this council forum? I've heard different views about that, because in effect that's requiring iwi to come into the system that we know and love, rather than us responding to a way that iwi would rather organise their affairs. But there has to be a halfway house in there somewhere. I don't have those answers, but I think we've got to get down to that space. And yes, I'm more than willing to come and be involved in any workshops that you want. The final thing I'd leave you as an idea is that there's a light rail debate going on in Auckland. That was accelerated, or certainly got some more attention when NZ Infra or the Super Fund put in effectively an unsolicited bid. What my pitch to the metro sector of LGNZ was if LGNZ could organise itself such that a policy like this made sense for them, and that's where you'd have to work with your smaller members to make this available, then I see no reason why local government New Zealand couldn't pitch this to the Crown. There are some things about local government that could be very helpful to the Crown if we did things in a slightly different way. The port debate that we've got going on, and you have in your area, and the fact that we don't have a national port strategy is one that could come up. Your city and the city I sit in, or Wellington, would love congestion charging. If you could get a mandate from the people through your long-term plan process, which is just about to kick off, that would really, really help. So I think there are things that local government could give that are sensible, that would add to national, and maybe you could make a pitch to them rather than waiting or just asking with a handout, if you know what I mean.
Councillor Aubrey.
My question's been answered.
Great minds. Councillor Baldock.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Fantastic presentation. You mentioned at the beginning that the dilemma, the problem is both 3-year terms and MMP to a certain extent. Am I correct? Is that what you said?
That's a contributor, yeah.
Yeah. The MMP, though, while a problem, is also an opportunity. And if I was listening to your pitch right now and you were standing in this election, I'd be voting. So my question is really, because getting this 90%, 10% split of funding is the biggest problem we face. Getting our share of money off the central government is no small feat. You're familiar with the age-old sayings of the chief aim of every government is to stay in power and also to stay in charge of the money. So where is the infrastructure party or the local government party in our political landscape that could actually deliver what you're trying to deliver without just being a lobby group going to Wellington all the time, making endless presentations and never, ever really being listened to?
Oh, I'm only 6 months in, so I've got that naive optimism of young lawyers and politicians, so I haven't yet been chopped apart, so I'm just going to keep going until, like that night in Monty Python, my limbs are being chopped off. But we do have some friends, I have a little bit of naive hope in that things like the Infrastructure Commission have been set up and they've been bipartisan supported. And the reason for that is that we managed to convince politicians that actually you don't get rewarded for doing nothing. You get rewarded for doing something that is good. And so in order to do something that is good, you have to give up a little bit of power in order that you're going to have the tools to get more stuff done. And that argument won the day from both National, NZ First and Labour, and so we have an Infrastructure Commission. Now, we have a watered-down version of a zero-carbon bill, but we have a zero-carbon bill. We're going to have bipartisan support for Kāinga Ora and also for the infrastructure funding and financing, and also for the water regulator. So I'm seeing a bit of a trend towards the fact that politicians understand that because the world is very, very complex, because the organisations that they lead are very difficult to take risk in, and risk is everywhere at the moment and growing exponentially, that they actually need to find a path, a practical path to take some risk, because the alternative is that they do nothing and they're voted out. And so that's the path that we're taking.
And all power to you, Paul. I hope you succeed. Might talk to you in a year's time.
Look, I sat in Megan Wood's office. There was a chap you've got on the policy team at Local Government New Zealand who says there's been a Royal Commission on local government funding and financing every year since the 50s, 262 recommendations, and 3 have been recommended and implemented so far. So, look, I know it's hard, but the thing is, you've got to appeal, I think, to their base instinct, which is to stay in power. And I think the way to stay in power these days is actually to do something, not to do nothing. And I think privately, politicians will agree that they won't be able to do what they need. Kāinga Ora is an extraordinary intervention for the fact that we don't have the type of partnership with local government and the resource management system that we would love to have. I also think that it's unlikely to be the answer, because I think that the amount of collaboration and the clash between the NIMBYs and the YIMBYs is still going to be won by the NIMBYs for at least another 2 electoral cycles, until the under 35s in about 6 to 8 years' time become the majority of voters. So I think, my pitch to Minister Woods, to Minister Jones, the letter that I sent to Robertson last week was, you need all of these tools. There is no silver bullet, as you know. It's far too complex for that.
Councillor Robertson.
Thank you very much. Fascinating.
Yeah, Paul, thank you for making yourself available. You asked at one point in your presentation for feedback. I read your report last year, and I was heartened by the introduction, where you pointed out that New Zealand governance institutions seem to rank very highly, except our outcomes are appalling by international standards. And that gave me hope that someone's looking at outcomes rather than inputs and efforts. I am a little bit concerned, though, that we are in the middle of something at the moment. You've made the point that Waikato are not there yet, and that the lens through which perhaps central government are looking at that is an H2A model rather than the regional model favoured in your report. Also, I've noticed that Auckland City have kicked to touch the tangata whenua issue by going back to the Independent Maori Statutory Board. Now, the fact is they haven't come back with a sort of a unified position, and the chances of them doing that on the basis of history is pretty slim.
Councillor Robson, you're incredibly articulate as always. Please, I'd be
Yeah.
most grateful if
Yeah.
you'd phrase it as a question.
I noticed that LGNZ also are not yet in the place where they need to be to make this happen. They're still debating the localism thing. Turkey's not voting for Christmas. Come back to it. Is central government really where they need to be? One of my colleagues here raised the issue, and for me it's a big one, about is central government prepared to sign an MOU with this sub-region? Because we've been here before. In 2004, we sat down and put together an agreement with central government in the room about how we would fund the infrastructure going forward. And central government were the first to fall over in terms of delivering what was agreed there. So is central government really in this place? Or is Megan Woods, as ministers occasionally do, talking nicely but not carrying a stick at all?
Look, I'm new to this. I've been on the board of Infrastructure New Zealand for 4 years, and I've seen a few disappointments, but I haven't experienced them probably as much as you guys have. The mistrust and the waste between central and local government is appalling, right? But it's not seen or understood by voters. It is, centrally advantageous to blame local government for a whole heap of things. The only practical way I can talk about rebuilding that trust is, something like the Auckland Transport Alignment Project was a really fraught project, but actually at the end of it, they had an agreed evidence base, they agreed the problems, they actually got some investment out of it, and that investment is accelerated. That needs to move, as the government has acknowledged, to sort of version 2.0 and 3.0. But, that's a start. That's why I've strongly recommended this Treasury investor confidence rating. At least you'd be talking the same evidence base, and you'd have a third-party view of what great looks like. So I don't have the answer, but I think the only answer is leadership, right? And so it's going to take real leadership from both sides of the aisle to change the paradigm. I'll put that back in your hands. We're very, very keen to help.
Thank you, Paul. I think you had one further slide. You were not quite finished your presentation. Is that correct, or have you concluded?
I just thought the value was more in the Q&A, but you could see the last slide if you like. Robin, if you've got that up there now. The idea was sort of a national development plan. So the Infrastructure Commission is going to deliver a 30-year infrastructure plan. Most countries, most forward-looking and well-performing countries have a national plan. But as you know, our central government unusually is not really involved in spatial planning, let alone national planning at this stage. So what our campaign is for this year, we have 5 policy priorities this year. In reverse order, they are the 3 urban priorities of urban water, of housing and transport. So urban areas are where 87% of Kiwis live. Our second priority is building regions, which I've just outlined to you, and that's about how we reform our government system so that we get better local, regional and national outcomes. But the first priority we have is that we deliver a national vision, which is what sort of lifestyle do we want? How do we balance the economic, social, cultural and environmental needs of future New Zealanders in 30 plus, maybe 50 years? So NZ First are campaigning on reducing population growth in New Zealand. I'm not suggesting we go the other way, but I think we need a population debate at a minimum. A Gallup poll suggests that if we opened our doors tomorrow, New Zealand would go to 11.5 million people who'd have 333% more skills than the current population of New Zealand and be 240% younger than New Zealand, than the current base. So I think we would love to see a central vision. And once you have a vision, which Tauranga does and my organisation and most businesses or charities do, but once we have a vision for Aotearoa, then you need a plan to go and get it, and that's that national development plan. That's then expressed spatially at the regional development plan, and then localism absolutely comes in at the community development plan. So that's what we seek as utopia, and we'd love to just take some baby steps along the way to getting that done.
Thank you, Paul Blair from Infrastructure New Zealand, for your time this morning. Thank you very much.
My details are with someone like Paul Davidson if you need to contact me.
Speaking of Paul Davidson, if we can hand over to you now, Paul. I just have a question, Paul, in terms of where we're getting to. You may cover it in a further slide, but Mia Webber this morning was engaged in a conversation with members on average residential rates in Tauranga. And I have a sense that that may be a topic of debate this afternoon. So if we have a shared set of numbers that we can look at, that might help inform that debate so that it remains factual. Thank you.
You're asking for us with the whiteboard, TCC rates comparative to Western Bay?
No, that's Tauranga City Council mean residential rates. Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington, Christchurch and Dunedin the same.
Yep.
And then residential versus commercial.
So next slide up, we're moving into that exact conversation. And there's only one slide, but there's a lot of extra information that's included in your Q&As from yesterday, and Jim is here somewhere over the back that's been able to get some more information this morning. So
maybe just one extra column perhaps. Yeah.
Sure. So just to run through the one that's on the screen, and I know that there's a lot of debate about this slide in terms of where we actually sit. Just to point out, this one is really referring to total rate. So it's simply the total rating revenue for those councils divided by the number of rating units for those councils. So it does not take into account any differences between residential, commercial or anything like that. To point out, Auckland obviously is a unitary. It doesn't include water and wastewater charged through Watercare. And I recognise the fact that the $300 for curbside is quite a dated estimate at this point in time and needs to go through a process, which it is at the moment, and that market has changed significantly since those numbers was done. So it will more than likely increase. However, I will imagine that a number of those other councils will be increasing at the same time because of the changes of the market that's happening in that space at the moment as well. And that was recognised in the commentary around Thames Coromandel in terms of one of the reasons for their increase that occurred. So probably the big things on this slide is where we are relatively, and the last column, which has been some conversation around this morning already in terms of where that commercial differential sits. So there's that information. The information included in your the question and answers that have been tabled as well shows further information. If I could find mine would help, amongst piles of paper, including across those councils rating at different levels. It's fair to say that that Jim and his team have had a difficult time in terms of getting like-for-like comparisons. I think you've got some more information this morning, Jim, in terms of ringing around some of those councils. But what is included is basically what's published on councils' websites, so it's very hard to have a comparison to comparison in terms of the actual equivalent value of those properties. So what it might be easier is if we just open to questions at this point in terms of, and then we can actually fill in some gaps as we move forward. I think the first one's probably going to be.
You have a comment, Councillor.
Just before we have our questions, it would be good to see what extra information Jim has procured over the last few hours. Is it coming, or do we have to wait for it?
We can adjourn for a few minutes, or 5 minutes, up to 5 minutes, I think, if that's agreeable. Yeah, Councillor Baldock.
Possibly could we, because it's part of this, the hard work Kelvin went through last night till midnight, if we had that to look at too and see how that relates to what the extra information is. I don't know, do you have it there to put up on a screen at any point? Because that's part of it. We want to get the accuracy of the figures and so on.
If I could suggest, if we had 5 minutes, we could do copies of those, both the latest information and the work from last night.
Actually, just before we hit into the comparison with other cities, is there any other matters that we can potentially discuss while that work's being done? I do want to give the members 5 minutes to stretch, but is there something... Okay, we have annual plan question answers. Okay, look, what we'll do, we'll just take a break for 5 minutes. Okay, just to have a stretch, and then we'll continue. Councillor Baldock, yep.
Just before we do, I talked to Paul on the break before. There's also another bit of information I think is available about the cumulative effect of rate rises over years, which might play into this as well, if that can be brought into it.
To the Chair, that information was based on the introduction of debt retirement levies over a period of time, so we can do that as well.
We'll have a quick 5-minute stretch. I'll address the two items which are on the whiteboard. Christine Jones, over to you.
I have circulated this to elected members, but I'll speak to it, so it's for the public record. So the first question was around the 1920 annual plan, around, and I presume this was predominantly around rates. What was consulted in terms of rates and what was the community response? The draft annual plan included a statement that the key issue in the draft annual plan is therefore not about this year, but about how we position ourselves for future years. Our best available information has highlighted potential future financial issues in a few years' time. The question is to what extent we start to address this now in the form of increasing rates revenue, acknowledging that more substantive funding options will need to be considered in future years. We seek your feedback on the issue. The approach we have taken in the draft annual plan is to lower the average rates increase to 3.9% instead of 7.5% increase proposed in the LTP. The feedback we received, there was 126 submissions in total on the annual plan, and 46 of those made comment on that fact, that question. 20 people were against a 3-point rate rise, or submitters, should I say. 2 supported this 3.9 rates rise. 15 submitters supported a higher rates rise than 3.9%, and there were 9 submitters who either their position wasn't clear or they provided other comments and feedback, and I've circulated the other comments and feedback to elected members. So if you're comfortable, that responds to that question. The second question that was asked was in relation to what has been consulted and is subsequently approved in the LTP in terms of both the commercial rate differential and the commercial rate quantum of rates. So in terms of the consultation, it was a phase-in over 3-year period, starting at 1 to 1.2 and increasing to 1 to 1.6. The decision that was subsequently approved post-consultation, the starting point of 1 to 1.2 was changed to 1 to 1.067, and at the end of the phase-in period, instead of as was proposed 1 to 1.6, it ended at 1 to 1.2. In respect of the question about the quantum, we've looked at what was the average commercial property at that point, acknowledging that commercial properties vary hugely, but just gives you a benchmark. So at that time it was 840,000. Consulted at the 1.2 rate was an annual rates charge of $5,037. At the approved rate, that was $4,318. So a $700 difference between what was consulted and what was approved. And in terms of the proposed 2020-21 average commercial property value, which now stands at just over $1 million, for scenario 2, option 2, it would be 4,991, and for scenario 3, it would be 5,198, and that has been emailed to you. So you're comfortable that we take those off the board, that we've addressed them?
Thank you for that, Christine. We've had a spreadsheet delivered to us, just so we're looking at the same spreadsheet. I believe it's the colour one, colleagues. There are 2 tables there. Excuse my handwritten notes all over the spreadsheet. I'm not giving anything away, I hope. So we're working off the same piece of paper here, everybody. Over to you now, Paul, to conclude your presentation before lunch.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the table that's been given out, that page, I understand, Jim, has come directly from those councils in terms of what their average mean rates are. So that's been a request that's come through. And the other page that you've also been given was the calculation, which was based on the numbers on the screen in terms of just dividing the residential and commercial portions by the number of residential and commercial ratepayers effectively. What you will see, there are some differences between the two, which we haven't had time to actually work through and understand the differences. However, the trends from my quick look at it are very, very similar in terms of what they show. So take any questions.
Questions, colleagues, or do you need a couple of minutes just to review the table before we look at questions? Councillor Robson.
It's really for the benefit of the thousands watching this live who are terrified about what their bills are going to be in a few months' time. Can you confirm, Paul, that both the clout
calculations, and the staff calculations show that Tauranga has the highest mean residential rates.
Yes, that's correct. Or based on the councils that are on the list, yes.
Thank you. I mean, I realise it doesn't help us solve the problem, but it helps, I think, frame the discussion a bit.
Thank you, and I do note that we have a record 21 people simultaneously watching live. That is actually a record, it is, believe it or not. Councillor Baldock, you looked as if you were ready to ask a question.
Yes, I would. We can take from the difference between, or the minor differences between the clout calculations and the others, and it sort of has to be a question to Councillor Clout, really. With the Auckland one, did he or did he not include the wastewater charge, which is in the CCO, which may not be there because you need to sort of come up with a figure for that?
Yeah, I think a couple of points. First of all, the Auckland figures don't include water and wastewater, so that would be on top. In the case of Tauranga, obviously, though, we also need to add on the proposed curbside rubbish and recycling charge, circa 300, maybe more now. And so, yeah, that's how you would rationalise those.
And Paul, what would be a reasonable wastewater charge to sort of surmise should go on top of Auckland's? They might just get ahead of us if...
Just confirming if Jim's 600, 500 he's saying, so.
$500, was that the agreed amount?
$500 for wastewater, $400 for water.
The water in would be, because that's separately charged for us anyway.
Added water into our charge.
Eh?
We would, because we have added water into our charge.
Oh, so you think both need to go into Auckland? That'd be $900 to go on top of Auckland's rates?
I mean, with Jim, all of the councils shown include water and wastewater with the exception of Auckland.
Yes, that's correct.
To add $900 to Auckland's mean average at 2.2844, which would put them to 3.744. Am I correct? Which makes them the most expensive.
Councillor Hollis and Councillor Robson.
So since we're going to muck around with water right now, the Auckland figures, is that split between commercial and residential? And is that split the same 900, or is there some kind of factor in there?
The Auckland figures don't include wastewater or water for either commercial or residential, but the Tauranga figures, we've included wastewater, an average water use of $395, but we haven't included anything for the commercial comparison. I don't think anyone includes water in their commercial comparisons.
Councillor Robson.
I'd like to thank Councillor Baldock for pointing out that Councillor Clout's numbers, there are some issues about getting an apples with apples comparison. I appreciate that. And he's pointed out that you'd need to add $900 to the Auckland number with the help of staff, taking it to some 3.7. He forgot to mention, of course, that Auckland is a unitary authority. So effectively, what we need to add to Tauranga's numbers are not just the curbside, but also the regional council number. The regional council number. What is the average regional council rate paid by a Tauranga residential customer? Apples with apples.
The average, probably around $300.
Looks like we're close to being first equal.
Yep. The gap's narrowing, but Auckland's still in front. We might need to add this curbside to it, but again, we haven't done it yet. We haven't actually heard back from the community whether they fully want it. So it is a bit of a moving feast, but even if you did, I think you still find Auckland has their nose in front. And it's important because this is actually, it's going to be a headline tomorrow if we don't get it right. We want it to be factual.
Additional questions, colleagues? I take it that there are no further questions. And Paul, does that conclude your presentation?
Yeah, just one document that Tracy's currently handing out was just a question on if we introduce debt retirement. In the past, what will be the cumulative impact of that? So the chart that's being handed out shows a one-off introduction of debt retirement into the base in 2011, which is the top option, which provides for 27 million of debt reduction over time and growing. The second is a 1% cumulative increase on year by year. And you can see the impact of that is quite significant in terms of 86 million and a 40% reduction in revenue over that 10-year period.
Got one question from Councillor Clout, then we're going to adjourn for lunch. Councillor Clout.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So, since we're in question mode, I'll just wait for staff to be... So since we're in question mode, I want to make sure that we understand the process around potentially... Sorry, I'll just wait. I want to understand the process around potentially increasing our commercial differential, given that in theory it's a long-term plan discussion, but because of the urgency of where we are at the moment, what is the process and how far can we go increasing the differential on commercial premises before we have to kick into that really special consultative process?
So it will need to be consulted on as part of the annual plan. There are no legal impediments in terms of why you can't move that, particularly within that framework of what you've already consulted on as well as part of that, which is to the 1.6 component effectively within there. So that can... That just needs to be a consultation process.
Yep, Councillor Baldock.
Is there a... Right, supplementary to that, if it wasn't consulted on, if the draft did not have it in there, but as part of the feedback from the community, council decided before striking the rate to include or to increase the differential, would that be able to stand the test or not?
The process would be a Section 80 resolution saying you're actually outside your policy at that time. We wouldn't advise that to take place on a rating matter.
So then my just final question, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. With these scenarios here in the debt retirement levy, we used to have one, did we not? And when did we cancel it?
Used in 2009 as part of that conversation with the community about financial prudence at that point. It was reduced in subsequent years and eliminated, just looking at around 2011, 2012, I'd have to confirm the date that it was removed. We still have some debt retirement in where we've used it on specific items. So for example, where we're funding OPEX through debt because of a long-term reason, but that's a specific reason, not as a general debt retirement component.
And if we had left it in, this is fairly clear what it would have delivered for the city. Right.
The amount that was in, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Clout, Councillor Hughes,
Thank
I
you.
do want to
very
give
quickly.
time
That's
for
fine. Very quickly.
members
So,
to
just
break.
in the interests of public education and for ourselves, any increase in the commercial differential, is there a corresponding reduction in the residential component, or is it on top of? Just so we all understand with the impact.
No, it's a reduction. It's a reduction in terms of residential. So your total amount doesn't change. Your distribution changes.
Councillor Hughes.
Just, do we know what it would take over the next, if we staggered it over the next 3 to 5 years, what the percentage we would need to do to that differential to bring us in line with consistently across the other major centres?
The first point is there isn't a consistent one. So they range from 1.7 to, looking at the screen, 3.25 within there. So the level of, it's a question of
I guess to an average
amount.
that would bring us sort of closer to, we're fairly substantially low in terms of the rest of them? I'm just kind of, have we done any work around that as to redressing?
So our original modelling when we did the LTP moved to 1.6, which is at basically the bottom of the other metros. So that work has only been done to that point.
Okay, members, we'll adjourn for lunch and we'll return at 1 p.m. Thank you.